There is a device that sits on top of millions of rooftops across the American South. Costs less than $100 to install, has no motor, no wiring, no switch, and no electricity consumption of any kind, yet has been independently measured to drop attic temperatures by nearly 40 degrees Fahrenheit and cut home cooling bills by close to 15%. It requires no maintenance for years at a time, and it has been working on the same fundamental principle for over a century. But walk through any new housing development built in the last 2 decades, and you will almost certainly struggle to find one. They have been quietly disappeared from the roof line of modern America, not because they failed, but because the system built around home construction simply stopped accommodating them. This is the turbine ventilator, and this is the story of what it does, why it worked, and why the industry decided to look the other way. To understand why this technology matters, you first have to understand what is happening inside your attic right now, on any warm afternoon, in almost any home in the country. Solar radiation does not pass through a roof cleanly. It hits the surface and converts directly into heat. By mid-afternoon on a summer day in Georgia or Texas, the temperature inside an unventilated attic can climb past 150 degrees Fahrenheit. That number is not an exaggeration. It is a documented thermal reality of standard residential construction. And that heat does not stay up there. It radiates downward through the ceiling and into the living space below, forcing every air conditioning unit in the building to run harder, longer, and at greater cost, just to hold the interior temperature steady. The Department of Energy has noted that every degree of increase in attic temperature adds measurably to your cooling load. A superheated attic can cost a homeowner hundreds of dollars a year in electricity they are not even aware they are spending. And for homes where ductwork runs through the attic, the problem compounds. Cooled air travels through pipes surrounded by 150-degree heat. By the time it reaches the room, it has already warmed back up. You are paying to cool air that heats itself before it reaches you. The engineering solution to this has been understood for over a century. Move the hot air out before it can accumulate. And for most of the 20th century, the turbine ventilator was the most effective passive tool ever devised to do exactly that. The device is deceptively simple. A round head of curved metal vanes sits on a vertical shaft mounted through the roof. When wind blows across those vanes, they spin. But what the spinning does is not merely rotate. It draws on 3 separate physical principles that compound one another into a surprisingly powerful ventilation engine. The first is Bernoulli's principle. As moving air accelerates across the curved surface of each vane, its pressure drops. That drop creates a zone of negative pressure inside the turbine housing that actively pulls warm air upward from the attic and exhausts it outside. This is not passive drift. It is mechanical suction generated purely by the kinetic energy of the wind, with no electrical input of any kind. The second is the stack effect. Warm air is less dense than cool air, and in any building with intake points near the bottom and an exhaust point near the top, warm air rises naturally. A turbine at the ridge of a roof with soffit vents at the eaves creates exactly this pressure gradient. Even when the wind drops to nothing and the head slows to a stop, rising warm air continues pushing out through the unit by buoyancy alone. The third is the Venturi effect. As air is forced through the narrow channels between the spinning vanes, its velocity increases, which further drops internal pressure and accelerates the exhaust cycle. These 3 mechanisms reinforce one another. The result is a device that creates continuous negative pressure at the highest point of the building, pulling heat-laden air out and drawing cooler air in through the soffits below, consuming nothing in the process. The performance data behind this is not theoretical. A study from the Air Infiltration and Ventilation Center found that turbine ventilators increased attic air exchange rates by an average of 15% across a full year, with peaks approaching 50% when wind conditions were favorable. Research across residential properties in San Diego documented peak attic temperature reductions of as much as 37 degrees Fahrenheit compared to buildings without them, translating to average cooling bill reductions of 14.6%. A family paying $300 a month to cool a home in Florida or Arizona could see over $40 come off that bill from units costing less than $100 each that draw no power whatsoever. In hot climates, the payback is measured in months. The origins of this device go back further than most people realize. In 1910, a British engineer named Samuel Ewart filed a patent for a spinning roof cowl designed to draw air from enclosed spaces and prevent smoke from reversing back into buildings under strong gusts. His design targeted industrial buildings initially, but the principle was recognized immediately as applicable to any structure that accumulated heat. By the middle of the 20th century, turbine ventilators had become standard fixtures on warehouses, farm buildings, schools, and residential rooftops across the United States, Australia, and much of the Commonwealth. They were cheap, durable, and required almost no attention once installed. In hot, windy regions, they were simply part of how a building managed its thermal load. The physics were obvious, and the results appeared on every utility statement. So what happened? How does a technology with over a century of documented performance, no fuel costs, no electrical demand, and a clear measurable impact on energy consumption simply vanish from modern construction? The answer is a combination of aesthetic politics, regulatory pressure, and the gravitational pull of an industry that prefers standardized solutions over effective ones. The first pressure was appearance. Turbine ventilators are prominent. They sit at the ridge, they spin, and they cannot be missed from the street. As American housing markets became increasingly governed by homeowners associations and visual uniformity codes, the turbine became a casualty of curb appeal. Ridge vents are essentially invisible, installed beneath the final course of shingles and blending into the roof line entirely. In a market where visual consistency drives property values, the invisible option wins regardless of whether it performs better. Associations began restricting turbines on aesthetic grounds, and some prohibited them outright or required placement only on rear slopes away from street view. That location often removed them from the path of prevailing winds and cut their effectiveness to a fraction of what the data recorded. The second pressure came from installation economics. As residential construction standardized through the 1980s and 90s, contractors developed a preference for systems they could install quickly. A ridge vent is a single linear cut along the peak, covered with a pre-manufactured strip and shingled over. No shaft penetration, no rotating component, no assessment of wind direction. For a crew bidding on price, it is the obvious default. The turbine requires more thought, more labor, and a higher level of specification. In a race to the bottom on installation costs, that extra consideration is enough to lose the job. The third pressure was regulatory. Building codes designed for tight envelopes were written around measurable, certifiable performance. A mechanical ventilation system can be rated to a specific air exchange standard and tested to prove it. A turbine ventilator's output varies with wind speed, temperature differential, and site geography. That variability became a regulatory liability. Some jurisdictions began requiring mechanical backup systems in homes relying on passive ventilation alone, effectively doubling the cost of a turbine installation without improving its output. The financial case collapsed and the turbine disappeared from the specification sheet. Then there was the problem that did the most lasting damage to the turbine's reputation. The ball bearings inside the spinning head are exposed to whatever the climate delivers. Salt air corrodes them in coastal environments. Moisture accelerates failure in humid ones. Ice can lock the head completely in freezing conditions. In the budget segment of the market, where materials were cut to compete on shelf price, bearings failed within a few years and produced a grinding, shrieking noise that transmitted directly through the roof into the living space below. One bad unit gave every turbine on every roof the same reputation. Homeowners who had never experienced a problem began requesting removal. The failure of cheap products cascaded into a perception problem for a technology that, when made correctly and installed properly, demands no meaningful maintenance for a decade or more. The reputation of the worst version destroyed the market for the best. The final blow came from a conflict nobody communicated clearly enough on the job site. When turbine ventilators and ridge vents are both installed on the same roof above a shared attic, they create a functional problem. Because the turbine pulls air more aggressively than a static exhaust point, it can reverse flow at the ridge vent, drawing outside air inward instead of exhausting warm attic air. During rain or snow, that reversed flow carries moisture directly into the attic. The fix is straightforward. Choose one exhaust method and use it exclusively. But when specifications were vague and crews were not trained to consider combined exhaust dynamics, turbines and ridge vents ended up together, moisture damage followed, and the spinning head took the blame. Roofers dropped turbines from their standard approaches and did not look back. What remains is a technology that genuinely works, costs almost nothing to install, demands no electricity to run, and has been sidelined by a combination of aesthetic preferences, contractor shortcuts, regulatory frameworks never designed to accommodate it, and the lasting damage inflicted by cheap versions of the product. In the right climate, installed correctly, a quality turbine ventilator is still one of the most cost-effective tools available for cutting the thermal burden on a home without drawing from the grid. For homeowners in hot, windy regions across the Gulf Coast, the Southwest, and the Sun Belt, the performance case has not changed. A pair of properly sized units on a standard attic positioned for prevailing wind and paired with soffit intake venting will reduce peak attic temperatures, lower cooling costs, and do it without a power bill or a service agreement for years at a time. But for most homes in most markets, they are gone. The code prefers the mechanical system. The homeowners association prefers the invisible one. The contractor prefers the faster install. And the industry has no incentive to recover a technology that generates no recurring revenue, needs no annual servicing, and cannot be metered. A spinning piece of shaped metal that removes heat from your attic for free is not a product that sustains a supply chain. It is a permanent solution. And permanent solutions are not what industries built around replaceable components tend to reward. A great deal of what gets left behind was not abandoned because it stopped working. It was abandoned because something more convenient to sell came along and filled the gap instead. If uncovering what actually performs matters to you, sharing that knowledge is the simplest way to keep it in circulation. And if you want to understand how that same principle of rising warm air can cool an entire home without any mechanical component whatsoever, then the video on the solar chimney is exactly where to look next.